In Singapore, 1/3 of all income earned goes to the top 10%. The bottom 10% get less than 2%. That's the rich-poor gap in Singapore. But income inequality has been a fact of life since the 1980s. Is it really a problem? Talking Point, the vote starts now. Good evening, everybody. Welcome into Talking Point, the vote. I'm Daniel Martin. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, we're tackling income inequality. Actually, we're asking why we should be worried about the rich-poor gap. After all, as Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam reminded us recently, income inequality has been high since the 1980s. But the government is worried. That's why the Prime Minister at his National Day rally talked about doing more for the lower income group. If addressing income inequality means more social spending, who should pay? Call in with your views in just a moment. But to help me answer this question, I have joining us on the panel today, Mr. Lawrence Wong, Acting Minister for Culture, Community and Youth.
Good evening.
Also joining us on screen right now, we have Economics Professor Hun Hian Tek from the Singapore Management University. And finally, Dr. Gillian Koh from the Institute of Policy Studies joins us on the panel. Our poll question for today, everybody, just let's see where we stand at the beginning of the show, has been, will you pay more taxes to help create a fairer and more equal society? As it stands, 52.3% are voting yes, 47.7% voting no. Hey folks, log on and start voting right now. channelnewsasia.com/TP. Send in your vote that way, online, okay? Let me ask this to our panel, actually. Would you pay more taxes to fund social programs? Minister?
Yes.
It's a yes for you.
Yes.
Professor Hun?
Yes, I think at this point we are a richer country and income inequality has stretched. That is what we would have to do.
A yes for you, Prof.
Well, like almost 50% of the people that were surveyed in the top income brackets said they would if the higher taxes meant supporting the needy. I suppose I would want to recognize that it's the people with the means who are saying that they're prepared to put down a little bit more.
Would you?
I would say, however, that if we do that taxes, we mustn't do it so that it becomes a case where we say the rich have to pay for the poor. They have an obligation and were entitled to their wealth. Okay,
we will definitely develop on this. So, I mean, but just to get an idea, Gillian, yourself, how about you?
I'm not here to give my own views, am I? Yes,
yeah.
Well, I would.
How would you vote? You would vote a yes.
Yes.
Any conditions that you would add to your yes, for example, Minister?
No, I agree with what has been said. I think this is an issue, income inequality, and we do need to have people who are able to contribute, who have benefited from the system, feel the sense of responsibility to contribute to helping the needy and the vulnerable in society. And I think that makes for a more inclusive society in Singapore.
Speaking of more inclusive, another point that has been raised, especially in the speech recently by Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam, was the idea of creating a fair and just society and a fair and just Singapore. That's kind of subjective to some people. Fair and just might mean very different things to different people. What does it mean to you?
I would say a fair and just society is one where everyone is rewarded according to his or her contributions and effort, firstly. And then secondly, as I said earlier, those who have succeeded and benefited from the system, I think ought to have that sense of responsibility to do more, to do their part, to take care of the vulnerable. So that I think within Singapore itself, the people who are down and out, the vulnerable, they will be able to live a life with dignity and respect.
Why should we be concerned and worried about income inequality today in 2013?
Well, it's not a new concern. It's something that we have been concerned about for quite a number of years, but it's been building up over time. And I think it's been building up because of big forces of globalization, of technological change. Globalization meaning more competition for jobs, for investments, so things get more difficult for the workers. Also technological change with machines and robots, potentially replacing workers.
So when people feel this happening, they feel that gap widening as well.
So I don't think people feel globalization, nor do they feel technological change, but what they can feel is that they feel their companies facing more pressure, they feel their jobs under stress, and they may feel pressure in terms of their wages. And these are real stresses.
In fact, we'll be talking more about the anxieties that people are feeling on the ground and what that means for you. Is it about affordability? Is it about income inequality, which is our big question for today? Let's take a closer look, by the way, at how income inequality has changed in the last decade.
Income inequality is the gap between the rich and the poor, and that gap widens when economic growth is high. Take the last 12 years, for example, when Singapore's GDP grew by 75%. In 2000, 27% of all income went to the top decile or top 10%. The bottom decile earned just over 2%. 12 years later, the rich have grown richer, while the poor are now worse off. In terms of earning power, the top decile now pull in annual incomes that are 18.5 times more than that of the bottom 10%. Another measure of income inequality is the Gini coefficient. The higher the number, the more unequal income distribution is. From 2000 to 2012, the Gini coefficient rose from 0.454 to 0.478. That's after tax breaks and government subsidies to help lower income earners.
A reminder, everybody, if you want to take part in our discussion, there are many ways to do so. If you want to vote on the poll, go to our website, channelnewsasia.com/TP. If you want to leave your comments and be on air with us right now, call in at 6691-0028, or you can tweet us at TPVote right now. One of the terms you heard in that video earlier on was the idea of the Gini coefficient. Let's take a closer look at that. As you can see, Singapore's Gini coefficient now stands at 0.437 on a scale of 0 to 1. Where 1 is absolute inequality. Now, as you can see from the slide, OECD data shows that even compared to the G7 countries, the G7 developed countries, Singapore's rich-poor gap is the widest. Let's compare it now to the Asia-Pacific countries. Singapore's situation, perhaps not as bad. Professor Hun, let's talk to you a little bit about this. Would you say that income inequality in Singapore has been caused by government policy, being open to foreign workers working in Singapore, for example?
No, I think that the movement of income inequality reflected both in the Gini coefficient as well as, say, the ratio of average income of the person in the top 10% compared to the person at the bottom 10%. Actually, if you look at these numbers were rather high in about 1990, and they actually declined until about 2000 when they began to move up. So really, a lot of economists thinking about why income inequality has widened point to globalization, point to skill bias technology change. But I think in Singapore case, a big part of it is really the fact that in the early decades of our development, manufacturing was a prime sector. And because manufacturing was expanding, as we move from disk drives to semiconductors, you were increasing your demand for workers who need not have extremely high skill, but you're pulling their wages up relative to the person at the very top. And so there was a narrowing of the income gap through the 80s and 90s. But what has happened is that Singapore, as many other countries naturally move into, they shift out of manufacturing into services.
Which is what we did.
Exactly. And so you have a lot of people who might have gotten a rather good job in an MNC based in Singapore in a factory, now has to move on into the service sector. And in the services sector, that is a sector in which our productivity has tended to be very low.
So it sounds like, I mean, is it a necessary evil that undoubtedly in an economy like ours, income inequality will have to exist?
No, I think you generally would have to have income inequality in any economy just to generate the right incentive for you to take activity. Why would you go to, spend an extra year in schooling other than the fact that you come out having a higher wage if you had lower education? But I think what has happened is that forces have indeed pulled up the income inequality. Let me also go back to that earlier point about...
I do want to pull in the rest. If you all have any disagreements.
I wanted to just add to what the Prof had said about the shift in our economic structure. Actually, manufacturing remains a significant share of our GDP. It has not hollowed out as such. Right? It's still maintained at more than 20% of our GDP. quite unlike many other developed countries. Yet, as Prof said, we still face issues of income inequality, and that's because even within the manufacturing sector, the nature of manufacturing has changed. We have gone to more advanced manufacturing, and the low-cost manufacturing has been offshored. They've gone to other countries. And so for people who are left in the sector, and if they are not able to upgrade their skills, they face a very real risk of having their jobs squeezed out. They may not have jobs, or even if they have jobs, these may not be very well-paying jobs.
If that has been you, we'd love to hear from you, actually. Call in with your experience, 669-10028. Sorry, Minister, let me just bring in very quickly before we go for a break.
I just wanted to add to that and say that financial services has become a bigger part of our economy. While Professor Hun was talking about how the services industry pulls the bottom down, jobs can be outsourced and things like that. The top end is also thriving, was thriving in the noughties, 2000s, and they are the ones pulling up that Gini coefficient, pulling up that ratio. The top end, for many years, was just going great guns. So that's how you get the divide. The bottom, yes, suffers from the fact that they compete with workers from India and China, of which there are millions and billions, actually. But the top end, of which there are very few, there's also... they're driving the wages up.
Can I also add a quick point that this trend is happening around the world, and I don't think we should see us as the only country facing it. And when we saw the Gini coefficient just now, which was on the slides, and how we are among the top in the world, I'm not sure how you got the statistics, but there are actually quite important methodological issues behind Gini coefficient numbers.
But why now? Why do we address this issue now in 2013?
I was going to say what struck me particularly was that when you actually even out some of these methodological differences, you realize that even in egalitarian societies like Finland and Sweden, their Gini coefficient before taxes and transfers is about the same as that of Singapore, which was quite striking to me. DPM Taman mentioned this on Monday, and I looked up the facts. And you may not get this number if you just look at the headline figures, because, like I said, you have to look at making sure that you standardize a methodology.
Then the other thing is to compare with other cities that are like us, that thrive on that whole services, financial services sort of sector.
Comparable models.
Right.
Okay, let's see where this stands as well. We'll continue with this line of thought and the idea of whether or not this is a necessary evil for Singapore 2013 and beyond. We want to get your views at 669-10028. Join the discussion on Talking Point, the vote. We continue just ahead. Welcome back to Talking Point, the vote, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Let's talk a little bit. Tonight we're discussing the idea of income inequality, and what we're going to be seeing is a brief list of subsidies announced by the government this year. Let's have a look at that right now.
As the income gap widens, something has to be done. One way of spreading income more evenly is through government transfers such as subsidies, grants and tax breaks. The latest leg up include housing grants to middle-income households announced at the National Day rally. They will get $20,000 from the government to buy a 4-room flat. More subsidies will also be given to help lower and middle-income Singaporeans with their doctor's fees. Earlier this year, after adjustments in the tax structure, the rich now pay more tax on their cars and luxury homes. As for the middle and lower income groups, they get some help in the form of tax rebates, MediSave top-ups and GST vouchers, all to the tune of $1.7 billion.
Now, these measures, of course, come on top of other measures to top up the wages of the low income, such as the workfare, for example, and to raise their productivity. Call in with your views. We're going to be talking more about that. The idea of if these exist, do we want to see more of them? Should there be more intervention? Who's going to pay for it? All this coming up in the next few segments. But now picking up on one of the last points from the last section. Gillian, let me come to you with that. If income inequality has been around 80s, 90s, always a part of our society. Yeah. Why are we paying so much focus and attention to it now?
Well, I think there was a bruising general election in May 2011, and certainly that's something that the opposition parties pounded home, that there was a sense in which people on the ground, the general public, felt that costs of living were high, things were unaffordable, and that they had voiced that sentiment for several years and felt that they were not heard. At least that was what the opposition parties were campaigning about. So that you saw the popular vote for the PAP dip, and you saw the loss of one GRC, but you also saw the very virulent sentiment on the internet and people talking about these things and whether the government's still connected with the people. I think this is certainly, I don't know, the minister will know, a spur to put greater focus on this.
Let me jump in there. I'm not sure that it is just simply a result of the internal political development. I think there are also broader forces that are probably inherent to our growth miracle. So we are one of the very unique countries that could transit from third world to first world in a generation.
And we're seeing the results of these broad forces here today?
And the thing is that the engine of growth has got to substantially change. Now, how do we grow from like 20% of US standard of living in 1965 and today up to about 122% of US standard of living? That was because we were in an early stage of essentially borrowing standard technology. Our openness, our good institution drew in the capital, brought in the technology, and we had a rapid pace of very steady growth. We were averaging a growth in standard of living like about 5% per annum.
So that was happening in that period. So why today?
Exactly.
Why 2013?
So in that period, in every 12 years, your income doubled. Now, when countries grow by catch-up, which they would have to in an earlier stage, they finally have to slow down. And the pace that is standard in developed countries, at the most about 2%. And even the US is struggling, even getting 1%. So I think what's happened is that in the last decade or so, we've essentially moved to kind of a mature economy, and a mature economy grows slowly. But because I went through such a rapid transformation in social at the time, I hear my dad tell me the story that when I first began, you know, I live in a kampong with people all squeezed into an atap house, and I moved to a 2-room flat, and then I gradually moved to a 5-room flat, and perhaps a condominium.
The mobility aspect.
So people have the sense that in their life, they ought to move up like an escalator, even though they are starting at a higher level than where their father was.
Okay, let's come back to the original question. Minister, your chance to respond. This idea of the broad forces that are having their results today versus the idea of potentially being seen as a more populist approach. Are we being more populist in catering to that?
I don't think Gillian was saying populist, but I would agree with her that both are at play.
Yes.
And, you know, there are broad forces at work, but there are also genuine concerns that people have raised. And that was crystallized, I think, more sharply in our Singapore conversation, which we have been having over the past year. So we're having a series of dialogue sessions, very intensive conversations. We've published the outcome of that. And I think that has given more impetus to what the government has decided to do now. Although, as I said, the series of things that we have done in terms of shifting our policies towards a lower income is not new. It started, as Gillian herself highlighted, in the mid-noughties in 2006. And so we have started making shifts already, but I think the Singapore conversation, the fact that these big forces continue to be at play and these big challenges continue to confront us into the future, I think has given us added impetus to make important shifts this year.
But businesses want to grow. They want people. They need workers, even if they're high-tech or low-tech. So you need to bring the workers in. And in Singapore, you have the
low-wage worker.
Certainly, at all levels. And Singapore is a place where there are more jobs than there are people to take the jobs. really. And so are you going to tell businesses that they should just stop it, they should not grow, they should not thrive? Are we going to tell our young people that they should not expect to be able to move up? They have that expectation, even though I think what Professor Hun was suggesting is not realistic. So I think the political process has to manage all these expectations.
Right. So even though social inequality...
meshed with what are the global trends?
Income inequality, inevitable, some people would say, in any society, but there are negative outcomes of income inequality.
Yes, and so I think that even there's a study by epidemiologists published in a book called The Spirit Level, and they set out the case of how income inequality causes stress, and people lose that sense of solidarity among themselves, which has real physiological impact in terms of sense of well-being. So there are some of those things where people have a daily lived reality of it being stressful because they can sense that it's unequal and they're not fitting in. There are 2 Singapores, 3 Singapores.
So because of that, do we need to pay more attention to it?
So in the end, it's not just an economic issue.
No.
Income inequality is a national issue.
Yeah.
Because
it's like
it's about a social compact, and it's about how we can stay together as a country.
Right.
Yeah,
but
I think in all that, though, don't forget that having arrived at where we are, being a first world country, the reality is, look at these developed countries, Europe, US, which are probably the first countries, well, UK initially, and then Europe and US. These are all countries that have grown very rapidly, very high standard of living.
Sure.
But look at the kinds of unemployment these economies are grappling with. Look at Germany, that has something like 3% unemployment rate in the 1960s. Now they are grappling with over 6% unemployment rate.
So looking at those examples, how do we make sure we don't go down that path?
So I think we have a double whammy sort of problem that global forces, as well as the shift into the services sector, widening our income gap that calls for attention. But I think that there is also the need to realize that now that we have become more mature economy, the nature of our growth engine has to change.
Okay, Gillian, you wanted a quick response to that?
I just wanted to say that we've also come out of a decade where Singapore suffered 3 rounds of recession, the worst of which was the impact of the global financial crisis. That happened everywhere, but also the economies that Professor Hun was referring to with the high unemployment rates and youth unemployment, these are countries that haven't recovered from the fallout of that. And also this sense of inequality, I think, has become a global campaign. You saw Occupy Wall Street.
Yes.
So this is a political movement as well, and you have to deal with that.
I would also add that I think when you look at the European models, they have largely gone on a social democratic welfare state model. And with good intentions, lots of government spending, but the outcome of very generous universal subsidies has been to, I think, inadvertently erode the work ethic and to erode incentives to work. And that is one important component and explanation of why unemployment rates are quite high across the board in these countries.
Well, when IPS did a survey, we asked people how would they like to provide support for the needy. Is it to give them what they need for free, for half price, or to give, teach them how to fish, right? That whole thing. If a man is hungry, what would you do?
Yeah.
And in fact, the large part of our respondents, who are the young, upwardly mobile people who responded to the survey, said we want people to be helped in a way that empowers them.
Okay.
Help them to help themselves.
Help them to help themselves still seems to be the sentiment on the ground. Let's see what our viewer has to say about this. Mr. Tay is standing by, one of our first callers. Mr. Tay, hello.
Hey, hi.
Thanks for joining us. Your quick comment, sir.
Yeah, okay. My opinion is that, the notion of, taxing the higher income to distribute to the low income has to be highly attenuated, because if you look at it globally, okay, it is something that is not welcome, right? Okay, you look at France, right? President Hollande has just tabled a bill to tax the rich, and it was rejected. And in U.S., some say that, the tax that's paid by the Warren Buffett secretary is having the same rate as the millionaire. You see, so the West has recognized that, by taxing the rich and going to the poor, it's not going to create a lot of jobs.
So what's your solution, Mr. Tay?
Well, that depends on what economic model the government is going to adopt, right? Are they a believer of, not taxing the higher income more so that they will spend and create jobs, or they believe the other way, or there's a balance in between, you see, right? I think we have to strike the balance first before we talk about this topic.
Okay, so the balance first before others. Let's see what Jonathan has to say. Thanks, Mr. Tay. Jonathan, you're on the air. Go ahead, sir. Hi, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
All right, thanks, Minister, and thanks, Professors, for being here today. My question is regarding so today's topic is about addressing income inequality, and we're asking who would pay to address income inequality by maybe taxing the rich and helping the poor through subsidies and other schemes.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, this is more of like a cure than a prevention. I believe that the cure is important, but we also have to think about how we can address income inequality at the root of the problem in the first place. Do you believe that income inequality, such a wide income inequality, is here to stay, or is that something that we can do to lift the wages and the employment status of low-income people through like a more structural change in the economic model?
Thanks very much, Jonathan, for sharing your thoughts. Minister, I'm going to give you a quick chance to respond before we go to break.
I thank Jonathan for that question because I think it's an important one, as I think redistribution can help, but it should not be the only way in which we address income inequality. And as he rightly pointed out, an important part of what the government is doing is also to see how we can uplift the lower income, low-wage workers, not through redistribution, but by giving them more opportunities, more skills upgrading, better career progression pathways, what NTUC calls the progressive wage model, which they are working very closely with companies and with the government to put in place in many of the industries.
So still help Singaporeans to help themselves, as Gillian was alluding to?
Very much so, but it's I think, one way in which we can get people who are in the low-wage workers, in the low-wage group, to help themselves, get better skills, and get companies to pay them more.
And
okay,
also,
will this work?
Yeah, also we want to break the poverty cycle, so we don't want the second generation, we want to help the second generation of the needy and disadvantaged progress as well. So that's sort of a lot more social programs need to be put in place. I think they've already been announced this year, so that the children get the education they need to level up and start at the same finishing line.
I do have to leave it as there for now. We'll come back on the same thought because we have to go for break, but we'll be right back. Who pays if this happens? Would you be willing to? Find out more just ahead on Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point, the vote, everybody. Thanks for staying with us. Don't forget, keep voting at channelnewsasia.com/TP, and you can also tweet us at TPVote. Our poll question for today, will you pay more taxes to help create a fairer and more equal society? 44.7% are voting yes, 55.3% are now voting no. A change, the no's have gone up quite a bit, actually. If you are saying no, call us and tell us why. Let's go to our first caller for this segment. Standing by, Lee Pin has called in. Hi, Lee Pin.
Hi.
Thanks for calling us, Lee Pin. Lee Pin, give us your views right now.
Yes, my concerns are more of a bread and butter issue. I think that, there's been some discussion online lately about having a progressive GST system, which means that, like essential items like rice, milk powder and stuff like that will be given a lower tax rate, and then for things like luxury items like branded goods, your status symbols should be taxed more instead of everything in a flat rate of 7%.
Would this be a more fair and just representation to you?
I feel that I personally, I don't mind if, let's say, I were to buy a branded bag. I'm paying for the society, in general, and I also don't mind paying more taxes when I'm younger now. And then when I'm old, I know that I'll be taken care of in that sense. But right now, I still don't see it that way.
Okay. Lee Tian, what's the maximum amount of tax you'd be willing to pay, let's say, on a luxury item?
Maybe 12. I don't know.
Oh, maybe 12. Okay, nothing more than 12.
Yeah, I mean, in other countries, their VAT tax are actually a lot higher. Yeah, and then, but for me, I feel essential items like for old people, for the poor and the needy.
How low should it be?
Maybe like 3%.
For essential items.
Yeah, for like rice and really essential items for the low wage income earners.
I take your point.
Maybe $100. It's a lot, but for people who earn a lot more, $100 for food is not at that.
Thank you so much, Lee Tin, for raising that up. We'll get the panel's view on this in just a moment. But let me squeeze in Derek's view first off. Hi, Derek. You're on the air. 66910028. Your views now.
Hi. I think Lee Tin's comment was very valid. A lot of it is in execution, but I was going to add one more point about a comment Warren Buffett made during the discussions about wage redistribution in the U.S. He did mention something about the folks who are in the high-income bracket didn't get there by themselves. They were raised. It takes a village to raise a child. A lot of low-income people, teachers, mentors, coaches, even their employees help the rich get to where they are.
Right.
So his argument was that, yes, then the rich who have gotten where they are today on the backs of a lot of other people do have some responsibility to contribute back a little bit more to society.
How much more? If it was a progressive tax like that, how much more do you think the rich should be taxed versus, let's say, the bottom?
Well, that's going to be the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because if you go too far, there's no reason to innovate. There's no reason to work any harder. So I think the fine balance is, well, the good news is we have advanced nations who have gone that route already, and you can see some of the results. Singapore already boasts one of the lowest income tax rates for advanced nations. So now the key is how much further do we want to go that still gives people the incentive
while keeping up the competition, attracting businesses, people to live here.
While still being low, on the other hand, help the low enough to actually meet their basic needs. So,
thanks very much.
So that's kind of where it is.
Derek, I take your point. Thank you so much for calling us. Let's see what the panel has to say about your views. Let me open it up to Lee Tin's suggestion. What do you all think?
I think that just to pick up first what Derek premised his argument on.
The Buffett comments.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think the central reason for why we might be prepared for people at the high end of the income distribution to pay a higher tax is to recognize the fact that when we succeed essentially because we are part of a society, and a society is about people cooperating. If I were alone on an island, a Robinson Crusoe, and I may be the most talented person in the world, I would never get the kind of outcome that we have in society.
Then
because
if you could...
our modern economy is about specialization. I do my job as a lawyer. Somebody else makes sure the place is clean,
sure,
and get the transport running. And so exactly because I see myself being fortunate as a result of the cooperation in society.
Is that too altruistic a view? Would others share that opinion?
No, I think that it is a kind of logic that has very good philosophical foundation as well. And I think personally, a person can be gratified because it is a reality that parental influences. If I have a dad who's a doctor, I start out better in life. And a person with a disadvantaged background is set further behind. And I think for people who have made it, I think recognize that the initial conditions are more favorable to them.
Starting points.
As a result of that, they are willing to give something back to society.
The starting points of where you come from, you were talking about that earlier on, Gillian.
Yes, but let me just go to an IPS OSC survey. And in fact, the higher income bracket the respondent is in, the more likely the respondent is going to say, yes, I'm willing to pay slightly higher taxes if it's definitely going to the needy. So we already have this sentiment in Singapore, which is something that is heartening. But let me just say that there are two broad models. You can have the state redistribute, which is what the minister referred to in the Scandinavian countries. So you pay extremely high taxes, you want the government then to redistribute.
We've got those figures actually from your survey, percentage of those who are willing to pay higher taxes to support the needy.
Right. But it's different from the American model where Warren Buffett is found, where the taxes are light, but then people act of their own volition to give back through philanthropy. So there are two broad models. Do you want to give it through the state, and then the state decides and means tests, or do you want to, out of your choice, support the causes that you want and give lots of money towards it? In Singapore, we do both. We have the government subsidies, we have government also matching the funds that you give to when you give to a charity.
Which would work for Singapore today?
Well, I think we do need both. So I think we are looking at government playing a bigger role, which PM has said in the National Day rally, that we will play a bigger role, which means government will have to have more revenues in the future, increasingly, to finance more social spending so that we can maintain this social compact and look after the poor and needy. But at the same time, you do not just want the redistribution to be done by the government alone, right? And I think government actions should be sustainable. We should make sure that they are affordable. And thirdly, we want to make sure that government actions also help to support community efforts. And I think that's a very important part of philosophy in government.
I think that underlying all that, though, the point about being able to sustain the redistribution with an appropriate level of tax, I think is ultimately also coming back to the question of what is the new source of growth. Because primarily, you know, we produce a transition from third world to first, generally with relatively low wages, because the market was pushing us up. And fundamentally, the reason why we caught up in a way that most of the world has not, because in a world of 7 billion people, about 2.6 billion people are still living on $2 a day. So there's a growth model there. Why did they not quite catch up? Well, I think partly because Singapore in the very early days caught up on this reason. Well, Dr. Albert Winsemius said something really powerful for us. Back in those days, he said essentially go out to woo the MNCs. But what he was trying to point to was really that the source of growth for a very small country like Singapore is essentially to ride on the global economy, to ride on the possibilities that the global economy delivers. Now, it was a lot easier in the earlier phase when it was just borrowing technology. Now we are up there. Now we have to compete. Now we also have to create technology.
So are there those new sources, like you said?
So there are new sources. The point is that it's a lot more difficult. SMEs have some distance to go, but I believe that the fundamental perspective we need to keep is a perspective that says our growth must ultimately ride on our taking the opportunities that the global economy delivers.
Then Prof. Hun would be of the opinion that we keep direct taxes to businesses and people as low as possible. They're already top band is already 20%. So that
go
entrepreneurship
our
would thrive.
Personal income tax, I think some distance a little bit.
But the corporate tax has been steady at 17%. I don't think anybody's talking about changing that.
But the personal income tax rate at 20% is unusual. Well, is historically and comparatively low, because you are looking at the US, for example, a top marginal tax rate is still about 40%.
So should be, if we raise it, to what extent?
But having said that, there are lots of taxes on luxury items.
Yes.
I mean, we know that this round in the budget, that you would be taxed more if you have a second home, a luxury home, you know. So that's already happening. And though we have a one-rate GST, we know that also the people who are needy and disadvantaged get a lot of transfer payments. So let me just cite something from...
Oh, I've got 2 phone calls, but yes.
Right. But basically, if you look at the government stats, the households at the lowest level get something to the order of, if they are in one room, they had in 2012 more than $5,000 in government transfer payments. And that is to really make up for the fact that they pay that one rate, whereas the people at the top end got $500.
So I wanted to say that when you look at all these different tax streams, I think rather than look at individual tax items, whether it's GST, income tax, personal or corporate, let's look at our overall taxation system. I think we want an overall taxation system that's progressive. That means those with means pay more, and then those with less means, they pay their share, but it will be lower.
But if you look at the results of the survey, those earning $10,000 and above, not as willing to pay. I'll come back and get your views as to why.
It's a slight difference, but this is their view. But this does not reflect the current nature of the tax system. The current nature of the tax system is highly progressive, and indeed those, I think on the income tax side, 80% of income taxes are paid by the top 20% of Singaporean households. In terms of total taxation, 50%, half of our tax collected is paid by the top 20% of Singaporean households. That's a very progressive system.
Let's see whether you agree with that and whether you would want to see more fine-tuning to that situation. The discussion continues after the break. Stay tuned. We'll pick up the calls then as well. Welcome back to Talking Point, the vote, everybody. We've got a great discussion going on. Professor Hun, I'm going to start with you. You talked about, tax rates for the wealthy. What is the, very quickly, what is the maximum tax rate for the wealthy that you would advise?
Well, as I said, the US has a rate of 40%. The top marginal tax rate, we are at about 20%.
So you would say somewhere between 20 and 40?
I think that there's still some room there to go.
Okay. Yeah. Minister, your response to that figure, some room meaning 20 to 30?
Yeah. I'm not the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so I will choose not to respond to that particular question. But like I said, I think PM has already talked about how we have enough revenues to finance social programs for now. But he has also said we may need to do more, raise taxes in the future because the social spending will increase, the spending requirements will increase. How to do so, I think that's something MOF will have to decide. What's the best way? And the exact figures. But the principle of it is that in increasing taxation or increasing revenues, we must always ensure that the fiscal system remains progressive. I think that's a key principle which we have always maintained and will continue to do so.
What our viewers have to say. Daniel's joining us right now. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
You're on the air. Great name. Let's go ahead, please, with your comment.
Actually, I'm fundamentally against raising taxes for subsidies.
Okay.
I feel that it is anti-meritocracy. It is anti-Singaporean in that way. In school, we're taught if you work hard, you study hard, you get a good career, you get paid well.
What about the arguments that were raised by the panel early on that you've been able to achieve that because perhaps you've stood on the shoulders of others who came before you and helped raise you up?
Okay, yeah. Well, I'll talk about that later. But if you're taught that in school, the students will have to learn that there's two sides to the coin. Likewise, if you continually not want to work hard, if you fail and you don't make the grades, you don't get the degrees or the diplomas, you're not going to have that high-paying job. So that idea that has to be enforced. There shouldn't be a unequivocal sense of entitlement that Singaporeans should have. If you do well, you get it. That's meritocracy. If you don't do well, you shouldn't be entitled to it. I don't believe that the subsidies should be pumped directly into subsidizing the cost of living, like cheaper housing, cheaper groceries. What the subsidies should be pumped into is for people who are willing to upgrade themselves later on in life.
How do you gauge that?
I suppose free education, free tertiary education, or heavily subsidized tertiary education. So those people who want to strive harder in life, maybe they reach their 20s and they realize they are not going to go anywhere with an IT diploma, and they need to get a degree, they want to get a master's. Those people should be incentivized by having free education or being paid for.
Got it. Thank you. Daniel, I'm going to have to leave it as there because we've got another caller standing by, but I take your point. Thank you very much. Shabab, we've got you next. Hi, Shabab.
Hi, everybody.
You're on the air. Your quick comment, sir. We've got to keep it a little bit tight. Go ahead.
Yes, the government is moving in the right direction. And by listening to the people on the ground, getting the feedback, tripartism from the union, cooperation from the management, I believe that a lot of people who are from the bottom end of Singapore's economies, the needies, they will benefit a lot. The government is moving in the right direction. Probably we'll have to wait and see where it develops ahead.
As more and more of these subsidies come to light, Shabab, who do you think should be paying for that? Are you willing to pay more for your taxes?
Definitely.
How much more?
As much as I can, I will contribute to the best of what I can afford. And I think many more Singaporeans who are well off, I think they'll be more than willing to do their part.
Thank you very much, Shabab. Two very differing views right there. Let's open it up. Well, Minister, your response.
I would say that both are not contradictory, actually, because Daniel, even though he said he didn't want to, later on said that if the subsidies were properly designed such that they encourage the individual to work hard, to upgrade himself, that's something he would support. And so it's not contradictory. We can spend more, we can have eventually, subsequently, more taxation if needed in order to spend more, but it's then the question of how to design government spending in such a way that it does not erode the incentive to work, in such a way that it actually encourages people to upgrade themselves.
And also in such a way that people know that their money that they've paid is going directly to these social programs.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the design of the social programs are critical, as Daniel rightly pointed out, because we have seen the examples of European countries which have gone the way of universal entitlements, and they have not worked. In fact, they have ended up becoming a huge fiscal drain, and what that means is that it becomes a burden on the future, on the children or the children's generation. So we have to make sure that when we do more, we design our programs properly so that they are sustainable, not just for 1 or 2 electoral terms, but they are sustainable for generations to come.
Okay, I want to take another call before we get more responses. Rachel, hi, you're on the air, 669-10028. Hi, Rachel.
Hi. Okay, personally, I think that foreigners and permanent residents should be paying more taxes. Firstly, because, from where they're coming from, I'm assuming that most of them are paying less taxes here in Singapore. And I also feel that they have come in and enjoyed our infrastructure and the safety and security that we have built over the years. I think that they should pay higher taxes.
Are you talking about white-collar professional, blue-collar?
Well, be it white-collar or blue-collar, I think the emphasis is more on white-collar because a lot of white-collar workers, they come here. I'm presuming that they are not making $500,000 and above. So in that case, the taxes they're paying are probably less than 10% or thereabout. That is extremely low for the kind of comfort that they're experiencing here. The efficient transportation system that they're having here, the good schools that they're having here.
Oh, your phone connection's getting a bit... I take your point, though, but your connection's getting a bit wonky. But thank you very much, Rachel. Gillian, your quick response to that, taxing foreigners more?
Well, actually, my first thought is that foreigners and PRs are getting less and less with each passing day in Singapore. I think today the headline is that PRs would not be allowed to enter the sort of housing market with a 3-year wait. Yeah, so I think they're going to say, well, what do we really get,
by being a PR?
Yes, and they are making an economic contribution already. So I think that what it is that we should really look at how overall those who are better off, who want to pay a little more taxes, do that, and that there is also the need to support philanthropy so that people choose to give back in the way that they want to and they see needs exist. Yeah.
I think we should be quite careful too, because in some jurisdictions like America, they have worldwide taxation, which means that their citizens in Singapore pay American taxes as well as Singapore taxes. So it's not as though they are not paying their taxes back to their home countries as well. Right? That's number one. And number two, I'm not sure that I know of any jurisdiction that does taxation on the basis of differential income taxation on the basis of citizenship. Right? It's on the basis of residence, or residency rather than citizenship.
So likewise, we should be focusing on the whole tax system.
I would imagine that, I would think that we should look at the whole tax system. Whether or not, in terms of benefits to foreigners, that's a different matter. But in terms of tax, I think we look at the system. If they are working here, they are paying a tax, then they contribute to taxes in Singapore.
Well, there's one more pot of money that we've not talked about, which is the national reserves, and that's a really hot political issue. When on earth will we actually use these reserves? And I think that, in the political contestation, there's going to be a lot of discussion of whether we can raise the percentage of the net investment returns that we use in order to fund social spending. And I think that in the last general election, there are political parties who are also saying that we should spend from the principal sum. So that's something that's there, but I would say it's actually
I think that the model for using reserve gets back to the point I made, that in order in the new phase to continue to grow, we have to remain integrated in the global economy. But that means being subject to severe shocks, such as the 2008-09 financial crisis. And there could well be new, unanticipated big shocks ahead. And I think the way to then think about our reserve is to draw upon it when we are hit by an extremely bad shock, as we were in 2009.
And only in those situations.
And only in those situations.
Okay. Mr. Wong, I'm going to leave it with you, actually. This was also a very common question on our Facebook page. People want to know whether or not, why are we not privy to know the amount? Is this an untapped potential, or should we only tap on it in times of emergency?
The reality is, as Gillian said, we are already drawing on our reserves, but we are drawing it by way of net investment revenue.
Right.
So it comes in from our net investment returns, and it comes in as part of our budget. That contributes to 2% of GDP. It's more than we collect from personal income tax. It's not a small amount. The entire amount that we collect from personal income tax is not as large as what we are getting from our investment returns, which goes into contributing to social government spending. Should we then draw more is a question. So the first thing is we are already drawing from our reserves from that income stream, and it's not an insignificant amount. Should we do more? I think then we have to balance between how much more.
Ian says that he anticipates having to raise taxes or something if we want to sustain MediShield Life, for instance. People would want to know whether it would be direct taxes, indirect taxes, or whether you could just touch the reserves for the pioneer generation, things like that.
Minister, I'm sorry, I've only got 30 seconds. A quick last response.
So I think we just have to make a very considered, careful decision, because I think our reserves are there for our rainy day, and we have to safeguard that for the rainy day. And the more we draw on it, even by way of the proportion of net investment return, it means that the value of the reserves will go down, and we will have less for the rainy day.
Do you agree with what has been said? Would you like to see other options, or would you like to see the reserves play a bigger part in some of these subsidies? Thank you all for your thoughts. Keep sharing them on our Facebook page. Search for Talking Point. We'll see you next week. I'm Daniel Martin. This has been Talking Point, the Vote. Thank you.